near the tree. The family, the animals, and the fairies lived, feasted, and celebrated together in the forest. They were very happy. The forest was surrounded with a barren and rocky land. In the barren and rocky land, in a cave, lived 2 dragons. The dragons were jealous of the forest. The dragons were jealous of the animals. The dragons were jealous of the fairies. The dragons were jealous of the family. The dragons wanted the forest all for themselves. One day, the dragons entered the forest. They roared their loud dragon roar. They swiped their sharp dragon claws. The animals were frightened. The fairies were frightened. The family was frightened. The dragon said, "You must leave the forest. The forest is ours." The animals ran from the forest. The fairies ran from the forest. The family ran from the forest. They ran out into the barren and rocky land. They ran until they came to the dragon's cave. The dragons climbed up into the enormous tree. The dragons tried to get into the treehouse, but the doors and windows were too small for them. So the dragons draped themselves over the branches of the tree. The dragons guarded the forest from the enormous tree. The dragons roared, "The forest is ours." In the cave, the family was hungry. The animals could not gather food. Without the tree nearby, the fairies had no magical powers. Everyone was helpless. Without the fairies' magic spells, the weather grew colder and colder. The family and the animals shivered with the cold. They huddled in the cave to keep warm. They looked at the forest in the distance. They all said, "We must find a way to get home." But no one knew what to do. In the forest, the lake froze over with ice. The dragons in the tree shivered with the cold. The dragons grew weak and sick. The dragons sneezed. When they sneezed, fire flew out of their mouths and noses. The forest around the tree caught on fire. The dragons were trapped in the tree. The family and the animals and the fairies saw the forest burning. The dragons were too weak to fly. The forest would burn down. The dragons were trapped. The tree would burn down. The fairies would lose the source of their power. The animals would lose their home. The family would lose their home. All would be lost. They heard the dragons' cries. All rushed into the forest. The lake was frozen solid. They called up to the dragons, "Breathe your fire! Melt the ice!" The dragons climbed out of the enormous tree. The dragons melted the ice with their fiery breath. Ants chewed through trees. Fox and wolf carved the wood into buckets. The family filled buckets with water. Birds flew high up with the buckets and dropped the water on the fire. Groundhogs and worms dug a trench around the enormous tree to protect it from the fire. The fairies, near the tree once again, felt their magical powers return. They cast a spell over the dragons. The dragons fell asleep. After all, everyone knows there's nothing better for a cold than sleep. While the dragons slept, the family, the animals, and the fairies built a big, beautiful house for the dragons in the forest. When the dragons woke up, they felt much better. The dragons thanked everyone for saving them. The dragons learned that life is much better when you share the things you have with friends. It sure is. The dragons moved into their house in the forest. The family moved back into their treehouse in the enormous tree. The animals gathered food in the forest. The fairies used their magic to keep the cold away from the forest. The dragons cooked the food with their fire, careful never to set the forest on fire again. The family, the animals, the fairies, and the dragons lived, feasted, and celebrated together in the forest. And they all lived happily ever after. And that's our third story. Now, before Mrs. McMorris' class leaves the stage, can I have Mrs. Maroney's class and Miss Maroney's class and Mrs. Stevens' class stand up and